Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Before we begin, I wanted to say that we're taking what's happening in the country around George Floyd and the protests very seriously. And we plan to discuss how these issues relate to our industry next week on BizTalk's call next week. With that said, this week we're continuing the conversation on safety on set. We have a great panel here. Thanks everybody for joining us. One of our panelists, Dan White, is going to be joining us in a few, but let me get started in the sense of introducing everybody. I'm gonna just keep it short and not go too much into all of your bios. Susanna Robbins is the Executive Director of San Francisco Film Commission. Sean C. Rice is a photographer, director, and digital composite artist based out of LA. Paul, sorry, Paul, I might not pronounce it right, but it's Papanek, is that right? Papanek is a commercial producer based out of LA. Dan White, who will be joining us momentarily, is a director of operations for National Set Medics and also is a COVID-19 consultant. And we have Chad Hoxie, who is the Senior Vice President of Alliant Insurance Services. Is that right?
That's correct.
And Alliant is also, Chad, you work with Smith & Stillwell, which is the APA members' payroll service. Juliet, and we have Juliet with us, APA National Director. Is there anything you wanted to add today, Juliet?
Only if people have resources and information that's either helpful for on-set or for other issues that are coming up right now, we're interested. We want to help share and push out information. So we are looking for to the community to help us provide those resources. So there's a lot of discussions behind the scenes, but whatever anybody has, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder, if you have questions, put them in the question and answer box, not in the chat box. Also, there is a possibility that we're going to go over an hour today. If anyone needs to sign off, please do. We have a lot to cover and want to make sure that we're giving you as much information and options for safety as possible. Okay.
And we'll be posting this on YouTube later, so if you miss anything, it'll be up there in the coming days.
Right. Okay, Susanna. So wanted to start with you. And I don't know if anyone out there has seen, there was a white paper that just came out yesterday. It was put out by the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. And they formed a industry-wide labor management safety committee task force. And it was a 22-page paper. And tell me, if that has any effect on what SF Film is working through, and just give us a little sense of where SF Film is right now in like the permitting process, and how you're managing all of what's happening through, from the state level as well.
Okay, thanks. Just as a quick correction, we're Film SF, and SF Film is the Film Society. So people get us confused all the time, which is, quite understandable. But we are the permitting agency for the mayor's office, City of San Francisco. So, so we did recently open up for permitting, but it is honestly very little at this time. Our parameters are you have to have cast and crew 10 people or less, and this does not include pods of 10, which I had a lot of people ask me, could we do pods of 10 where we have 10 people at this location and hair and makeup is 10 elsewhere and transpo is held over here with a pod of 10. And the response from our city attorney was no, not at this time. So it's cast and crew, 10 or less. You have to be able to meet our social distancing guidelines from the Department of Public Health. You have to be wearing a mask. All your cast and crew has to be wearing masks. You have to have the ability to sanitize your hands. So either hand washing or hand sanitizer, personal hand sanitizers for everybody. And so basically, the permits that we are getting, we are evaluating on a case-by-case basis to be sure that we can permit the productions safely, that the productions are safe, as well as the public. And so because of that, it's not just a quick review, 4-day turnaround process like we have done in the past. I have to send every permit to our city attorney. The city attorney has to feel like they fall within the guidelines that can be met, and then I can turn it back around. But because our city attorney is just inundated right now with requests from every single department with all these questions, not only about COVID, but about what's going on right now with all of the response, the protests, that they're inundated, and so it's taking longer to get answers on things. So we will make best efforts to turn permits around, I'd say within 7 business days, but again, I can't even guarantee that right now. Right. So white pages, they came out yesterday, and I'm so thankful they came out because it's a starting point for the state to then issue their guidelines. But when I read them, I guess, you know, they seem similar to a lot of documents I've read, which are about, again, social distancing, hand washing. The one thing that I thought was interesting, which I've heard talk about a lot, but now it's finally written, is having a designated COVID person on each production. Now, what that looks like for a smaller production, I'm not really even certain at this point. And I did send an email to someone who was on that committee to say, who trains these people? What kind of certifications are they going to have? So that's a bit of a mystery to me. But I think for San Francisco, I have forwarded that document to our city attorney to help them help us when we are having questions about productions. And I, just so you all know, right now in San Francisco, health orders come out, you know, every few days there's an adjustment. So last week we were working on, my staff and I were working on fine-tuning our guidelines for our permitting process. And then a new health order came out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon about everyone has to wear masks and you have to have them on within 30 feet of someone, whereas before it was within 6 feet. And so we weren't really clear on how that affected productions, because if you have your talent, does that mean your talent has to be 30 feet away from another actor? Mm-hmm. And we're trying to get clarity on that. I think if what I've deduced so far, and it has not been confirmed, but from what I read in the order, it sounds like if the person is stationary, they can take off their masks and be within 6 feet, or be at least 6 feet from someone. If they're moving, they have to be 30 feet away. But again, I have not had clarification from the city attorney's department. That's what I was reading in the health order. Mm-hmm. So every time a health order comes out, we have to look at what we've said and say, oh, does this still comply with what the health order is now saying? So we're in this very unprecedented time of rapid change, and we are really trying to see how we can adjust accordingly so we can get business up and running for everybody, because we really want to see people back to work.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like to me, any kind of guidelines that would be, let's say you actually are having like written guidelines. By the way, are there actual written, well, it's in the application process, right? That they're going to be.
Well, it's on our website. We have a link to permitting under COVID, and it has a list of guidelines right now. However, we are, as I said, fine-tuning those now because we felt like they didn't have enough information for people, and we kept getting the same emails over and over again. So we're trying to make those more clear, but before we can post them, we have to have the feedback from our city attorney.
And I believe from the Georgia state guidelines, they recommend some kind of COVID compliance officer. There's so many terms relating to that, by the way, but and then Washington State said it's required, and so yeah, that's definitely my question is if it's going to be required, is it going to be required on a 3-person set as well?
Yeah, right now, I can't specifically answer to that, but what we are going to be asking productions for right now is send us your health and safety plan. Because, and we're also going to be asking for a lot more details than we used to. We're going to be asking for each location, how many people are on location? How many actors are there? What are the actors doing? How do you plan to, and what's your plan to keep people safe? Does everyone, in your health and safety plan, you might say every person has hand sanitizer. They're all wearing masks. Masks are only taken off by the talent when their camera is rolling. But we just need to see that so that we know you have a plan. Right now, there is no required dedicated COVID person on set for these smaller productions. And again, I don't know what the state guidelines are going to say, but I think like the white pages to me really addressed really large productions, and it left this big question mark for what about these 3-person productions, and we're just trying to move ahead as safely as possible. Like I have a permit I'm working with right now. It's just a photographer and 2 subjects, and the 2 subjects and the photographer actually all live in the same household. So it's pretty easy to permit that. I have a 3-person drone shoot that's supposed to happen in a week. And they're doing it early on a Saturday morning in an area where you won't expect to have many public. So there's like very little things that we are pretty clear that we can permit easily. And then as they get bigger, it's going to raise more questions. And we just have to be able to give as much information as possible so that the city attorney feels comfortable doing the final sign off on the permits.
I see. Can you also just talk about like motorhomes, because that's something that is part of your permitting process, and has there been more developments on that and how that can happen?
Yeah, so again, I think right now, today, we would have a hard time being able to issue a permit that was going to use a motorhome, only because currently under the San Francisco health order, if you're not cohabitating with a person, you can't be removing your mask on an interior unless you can social distance. Now that isn't even true. You're not supposed to be removing your mask around people in an indoor enclosed environment. So I'm not really sure how we would even work with a motorhome right now. Someone's mic needs to be muted, I think. Anyway, so I need guidance on that from our health department, because right now my understanding is that that would not fit under the current health order.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Well, yeah, and then also lastly, San Francisco came out with some reopening dates and different phases, right? And how, I mean, and I don't know if you're the best person to kind of answer this question, but obviously there's so many businesses out there that don't know, like, can I reopen? Can my studio reopen? And like you said, around the mask issue indoors. But what's the best way for people to stay on top of finding out, or people that a photography business can actually be in business in the city, correct? If they're shooting outdoors. But how do people best stay on top of as this keeps moving forward?
So I think it's good to be checking the Department of Public Health website, because they have all the new health orders that have come out. Whenever they come out, they put them up there. And at the end of this, I'll send you a link that you can send out to everybody, where you can keep track of all the new orders that are coming out and read through them, because it'll spell out pretty clearly what's allowable and what's not. Like, in my mind, if you had, let's say you're doing a still photo shoot of furniture, you have no talent, you're just doing stills or whatever, inanimate objects, and you're all wearing masks, and you can social distance within your studio, I believe that falls under the guidelines. It's like working, but it has to, again, be 10 or less, because with current retail businesses, you could have people working in your place of business as long as it's 10 or less, and they can social distance and they have on the masks. So I believe that in those circumstances you could work. If you're using talent right now, you could not have talent in there removing their mask while you're all inside.
Okay, so you're saying that a photography business in a studio would fall under the current phase that's open June 1st?
Yeah, my understanding is, because it's kind of like a retail business, it would fall under similar guidelines of the retail business, but again, 10 and under, well, actually, our city attorney also said it would have to be closed to the public. So you wouldn't have people walking in and out, 10 and under, and you'd have to practice social distancing and wear a mask.
And would they need to be 30 feet apart? The people in a small, let's say they're doing the furniture shoot and it's just the crew and it's closed off to the public, in that?
No, I think then it's 6 feet apart. Again, if you look at the retail guidelines that are, I'll again send the link. I believe if you followed those guidelines, you would be in compliance.
Got it. Okay, good. Oh, that's good.
So,
to know. And yeah, so I mean, obviously we have people on from nationally, so it's going to be differing, of course, for your different cities and states. But we just wanted to present, you know, a case of San Francisco, just to get a sense for how things are working here, where I'm at.
yeah.
Well, thanks, Susanna, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to you here. So yeah, Chad, love to talk to you about insurance. Yeah, as you know, this is quite a question that people are constantly having around once they're on set and what's going to be covered, and you know, there's constantly different responses around what's covered and who, like, what is it, general liability, is it your workers' comp, and every shoot can be so different and complicated depending on who you're hiring, what they're classified as, whether they're 1099s or W-2s. Can you just kind of give us a place to start with workers' comp? And you know, it sounds like you're pretty aware of nationally, and how things are working and on a state level as well.
Yeah, so it really runs the gamut, and that's what makes it such a confusing topic, particularly when we get into the entertainment industry, because we have so many different roles that people can play, and then also the confusion as far as, is it an employee, is it not? And what becomes important to look at with workers' compensation is that in many states, including most all of them, and in California, the language is going to look at any employer, and when you use language as vague as that, it can be something as simple as you hire someone on, you're paying them cash to help you out for half the day. Is that an employee? And part of my background was adjusting claims, and there were times when we were adjusting claims in that exact scenario where the determination was that that person does become considered an employee for work comp purposes. And the interesting thing with that would be the fact that if we were using IRS or tax guidelines to make the decision, we would come to the conclusion that they're not an employee by those standards, however they are by work comp standards. So that just really further complicates all of these issues for people when they're looking to do a shoot. As it relates to the COVID-19 crisis, the big question right now for companies is, one, how do I protect myself? And two, does work comp respond to this? And as far as how do you protect yourself, the important thing to realize is that workers' compensation is a two-way protection. So one, it does protect that injured worker that you have by means of providing them with wage loss benefits, medical benefits. If they die, then there is actually a death benefit that goes to their dependents. Equally as important is workers' comp becomes the exclusive remedy, meaning that workers' compensation will come in and protect and defend the person that is the employer in that scenario. So that way you are protecting yourself from an unknown litigation exposure, and it's required by law. In some states, California included, if they find out that you're operating without work comp in place, you are subject to fines, you are subject to stop work orders, which could shut down your shoot. So it becomes a really good protection in that regard as well, because now you know that you are legally in compliant with that. And then I think it's also important to mention that right now in California, the governor had executed an executive order putting a presumption in place that should an employee get COVID-19 and they are working away from the house, the presumption is that they contracted that from work. And there is a 30-day discovery period to investigate that, to determine, did that employee actually get it from work? The important thing with that is, when you have the workers' compensation in place, one, the carrier is going to be charged with doing that investigation. So it takes that workload off of your plate. But secondly, and more importantly, is COVID-19, as far as what the total cost will be for a claim, are a huge unknown. We're seeing people really run the gamut where you have asymptomatic individuals who have had it and they never even knew. And you run that to people who may be in the hospital for months. And when you think of what those medical bills can amount to, we would look to workers' compensation to transfer the financial consequence of some of those potentially very large medical bills that can exist from this crisis.
Right. Okay. Gosh, it's one of those where, as you're talking, I have like 5 questions in my head. So basically, just on the basic level of going and having a shoot, you have a workers' comp policy, whether it's in California or other states, right?
Right.
There's a lot of talk about whether you're doing payroll or you're actually doing payroll through your own company. And it sounds like a lot of photographers, including myself, will do payroll through a payroll company. But in general, you know, when you're working with the client, you're trying to figure out who's going to be liable, and you know, if you're going to be putting out certificates of insurance, which you should still do, right? But when it comes to COVID, whether you're in California or other states, and you have a workers' comp policy, if somebody gets sick on set, we're covered, right? But like, there's a whole nother part of it where whether or not they got sick on set has to be proven either by the business or the actual employee, right?
Right. So, you know, by state, it's going to vary. And what's going to vary is going to be the assumption. And what in California, there's the assumption that they got sick from work if they're working away from the house, and it happens during this presumption period. You know, outside of California, it's going to vary, you know, and what that means is now the employee would have to prove that they got sick from work, or at least show the evidence of why they got sick from work. The coverage wording on a work comp policy is for injury and illness arising out of and in the course of employment. So it's a pretty broad language that it gives, and then it's basically covering it. So it's not just COVID. It's if your assistant is helping you set stuff up and they slip and fall and they break their elbow, now you have medical benefits for that. It's not going to list out specific, okay, we're going to cover, you know, this type of injury and that type of injury. It's a pretty broad language. You look to have that in any state that you're operating in. But with the COVID aspect, there will be a difference between, is there a presumption that says, hey, we're just assuming off the bat this happened at work, or is there some sort of claim that needs to be supported by evidence showing that the individual claimant did in fact get this from work?
And there's a lot of talk about the waivers and whether the waivers, if somebody signed a waiver, who's responsible after that?
Yes. And so waivers are nothing new, particularly in California. And the realistic way to look at it is the waivers wouldn't hold up. If you're looking to a waiver to protect yourself, it's really not the method of protection, because we have public policy in the law stating that an employer is going to have work comp in place. So you can't really violate the public policy by ways of inserting a waiver and saying, well, no, we don't have to do this. So the thing I like about the concept of a waiver or something along those lines is the awareness aspect. I think calling to everyone's attention and bringing awareness around items that increase exposure on the set. So for example, in the time of COVID-19, doing things that remind everyone of hygiene practices. And if you are not feeling well one morning, make a phone call, don't come to work. I think those are fantastic tools, but you know, at the end of the day, the waiver is not going to actually protect you from COVID as an employer, and it's not going to do anything for your employee that gets sick on set.
And what did you call the waiver when we spoke about it earlier?
I call it a paper tiger. I think it might be a tool that can be used to scare people into doing the right thing, but I think as you know, producers, employers, and all of us on our end, we need to be cognizant that that's not really how we protect ourselves and our team members.
Right. And you know, whether or not you have someone sign something, and if the court decides that you're negligent, I mean, in some ways, it almost, well, does it matter? I mean, I know that's a weird thing to ask, but if they're covered, you know, that doesn't excuse any negligence, of course, right? But
right.
If they're covered by workers' comp, right? So
right.
For them to take you to court because they got sick and they're blaming you for it because you were negligent, they would still be covered in terms of their damage, their bills, their hospital bills,
Right. So medical bills, you have a temporary disability benefit. So the wage loss that they're losing while they're out on the claim. You also are going to have defense costs paid by the carrier. So if they have an attorney or there's other legal pursuits involved with the workers' compensation claim, that would include people who are filing liens against your company for medical bills. That all transfers to the work comp carrier, and they start managing that process for you. And there are multiple components within a work comp claim, and so that becomes a great resource for you.
So let me ask you this: before Newsom signed this executive order, how was it? You know, wouldn't you have still been covered by that for that?
Correct. So what the executive order did in effect was it sped up the process in the way of, rather than a carrier looking at a claim, and in California, for instance, there was a 90-day period of discovery. So they had 90 days to make a determination if it's an accepted claim or a denied claim. And during that time frame, there were still medical benefits that are paid out to the injured worker until the claim is finally accepted. What his executive order did, in a sense, is it shortened the discovery period. So it shortened it down to a 30-day period. But it also kind of just made the language clearer so that we know that the claim comes in, it's going to be accepted unless you can show that the COVID was contracted outside of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody asked if for example, does Smith & Stillwell provide a certificate of workers' comp insurance that the photographer can show the client that they have?
Correct. So that becomes an important component when you're looking at getting payroll done. Make sure that you're getting the work comp, and yeah, we can put that stuff together, and we even have some tools that we can help put together as far as guidance when going on to a shoot, as far as just reminders of the safe practices, including the hygiene and what to do if you do have a suspected occurrence, sort of a cheat sheet, so to speak, as here's what you should do, and here's who you should call, when you should call them, how to collect evidence.
Payroll all of your employees through, say, Smith & Stillwell or other payroll companies. You should still have a workers' comp policy. Should you still have one for yourself, for your own business?
No, you wouldn't necessarily need it. And so, if you're just running, you're a photographer, you're a one-person operation, you're probably not carrying workers' compensation. You're maybe a sole proprietor or the individual 100% owner of your closed corporation. Where we find a lot of the trip up in that happening is you're that one person operation, and now you're doing a bigger shoot, and you have maybe 3 people that are going to help you with that shoot, and you don't carry a workers' compensation policy. Well, now you're going to have some exposure because you have 3 people that are working for you. And so that's one way where a payroll company like Smith & Stillwell could come into play. You say, hey, I have a week-long shoot. I don't carry my own work comp. And you can cover that liability to your business, know that you're taken care of, and focus on your shoot.
Now, and photographers are known to do what we call test shoots, where
yes.
Say somebody gets sick on that, you're in some cases you're paying the whether it's a stylist or any assistant. Some cases you're not. Workers' comp that may be a good reason to keep workers' comp, wouldn't it?
Right. Yeah. It's whenever you have someone that's helping you, I guess that's when you're entering this sort of gray area as far as, well, were they helping you as an employee? What was the relationship there? And the laws and protection of individuals are always going to be liberally constructed and liberally construed to the benefit of the person that may be considered the employee. So that being said, for instance, in California, if there's a 1% chance that that's an employee-employer relationship, then it's going to be treated as an employee-employer relationship to the benefit of that person that is possibly an employee.
Right. Good. Other questions on this?
Now, somebody mentioned that has a photo rental studio that they require having the workers' comp certificate. And if you hire people, you should be patrolling and carrying workers' comp.
100% agree.
And then there was a question, there must be case law regarding lawsuits over someone getting sick after working on a set with, say, H1N1. Wouldn't the plaintiff have to prove negligence?
So workers' compensation becomes a no-fault system, and really what they're looking at is, did the injury arise and out of in the course of employment? And so, like, to use an example of another type of claim is, we've seen like cumulative trauma type claims where someone makes a claim that, my shoulder is wrecked and I think I did this from 5 years of holding a boom mic. And so then you see them actually going backwards 5 years on a claim that spreads over time. And so it becomes the same potential for occupational disease, where you can have someone going backwards. An example of that would be a disease that takes time for the symptoms to manifest. So if we had a disease that takes 30 days for you even to realize that you have it, the claim is going to look backwards. It's very similar to, back when I was adjusting claims, if we had a claim come in for someone, for instance, like a healthcare worker that got stuck with a needle, and we're doing a test for bloodborne pathogens such as HIV or AIDS, it takes time for that to show up in a blood test. So there are some instances within the system where you might have a delay because not everything shows right away.
And Paul has a question for you. Do you want to ask it directly, or do you want me to ask it for you? He's going to unmute himself. Well, I'll ask it while he's
I've unmuted. If on the day of the shoot, the photographer or the key talent show up and they have a fever, and the shoot has to be postponed or delayed, is that a recoverable expense via insurance?
That's a tough question. So you're going to look into other policies that you would have outside the scope of workers' compensation. And the policies, as you might be seeing on the news right now, the things related to the pandemic and business income and those type of financial elements that we're experiencing don't seem to be there quite yet. You may have a type of event cancellation policy, and that may have some language in it that may be able to shift some of that financial consequence onto the insurance carrier. However, but your standard property, general liability policy, we're not seeing that sort of language in there at this time. And I would say on the go forward, now that we are in the COVID-19 times, it becomes especially important to be cognizant of the policy language and reading those policies, because the anticipation is that policy language will change on those lines of coverage. So we don't want anyone assuming that coverage is there for the next 12 months, because for the last 3 years, you've had this coverage in the form. So the safe way to approach policies is be skeptical. I don't think the coverage is here. I want to confirm the coverage is here.
Well, how should people going forward, with a shoot, what do you say to the client? How do you protect yourself, or what do you do in that instance if that happens? Do you have to pay everybody and out of your own pocket? How should we address this?
I think first and foremost, it becomes the perspective of making sure you're protecting everyone that comes onto the set. So, whichever workaround you have to make, if you do suspect that someone is sick, first and foremost, making everyone aware that if you wake up one morning and you're not feeling well, don't come to the set. Make a phone call, let them know, hey, I woke up, I have a fever, that's why I'm not coming. And as people that are running the set, we need to be appreciative and understanding of that, and communicating, great, please don't come here, because the worst thing that, can come out of that is they come to set because they feel like they need to, or they feel pressured to. And now we have 10 other members of our team that are sick.
Right.
And should the makeup artist be paid as an employee?
Well, it's depending on who they're hiring or who's doing the hiring and what their relationship is. Oftentimes, I've found that the makeup artists, they are, considered an employee. It's considered to be an employee-employer relationship. And so, that's something we can look at, because if you have a makeup artist that does have their own business, they have a business license, they don't have, anyone else really working them, becomes really clear cut. In those instances, you can have some comfort of saying, I don't need to cover you for work comp because you run your own business. And so, but then there's instances where they don't, and that person you may need to have work comp put in place for.
And if the makeup artist is working through an agency and you're paying the agency, then the agency would be responsible for them?
Yeah, so you just want to confirm with the agency. You want everything on any of that transfer that you have, as far as who's going to be the responsible party, just really clear in written contract, so that and sleep a little better at night knowing that individual's covered and who the responsible party is should anything happen.
Can you guesstimate the cost of, I'm reading a question here, guesstimate the cost of workers' comp for an independent photographer producing an 8-person shoot?
I could. Off the top of my head, no. Because actually I have all my systems shut down for the purposes of this call.
So contact Chad separately.
Yeah. No, but yeah, absolutely. We're able to, whenever anyone has questions on estimates or costs, that's something we can put together and bring clarity to them for.
Oh, yeah.
And are you saying that Smith and Stillwell's workers' comp covers COVID-19 injuries and claims?
Does it?
Does it?
Yeah. So currently we're not seeing work comp policies inserting language excluding COVID-19. And I can say that that would be something that would be very interesting if the work comp policies start to have that. It doesn't shift the liability for the employer. So the employer would still have a responsibility to take care of the injured worker's injury. It's just now that you have that exclusionary language in a policy means the insurance company's not stepping in to pay that claim. So that is other language that is continually being tracked in these policies, but right now I haven't seen that been inserted in policies.
And I have a producer, if I'm in New Jersey and I do a shoot in Utah, my company only employs me. So do I put everyone on payroll in order to have them covered by workers' comp? Currently, my policy covers me, but nobody else. What solution can I provide to make sure everyone is covered and won't sue me as a producer? Yeah,
so it's going to come down to how and who are hiring those people, who you're going to deem as, I guess, quote unquote, the employer. And if it comes down to where you're going to another state or another location and you need to hire people, probably the easiest way would be actually to use a payroll company, because then you can go to the payroll company, give the state, give the duration of the shoot, and you can get charged on just what that amount is. Whereas if you took your own policy out, say you go to Utah and you take out a policy, the policies are usually running on a traditional plan, a 12-month period. And some of them have minimum premiums. So what may actually only cost you $100 to do a shoot, when you go in to get a traditional policy, now you're maybe paying a $500 minimum premium. You're going to have a policy that's sitting out there for 12 months. You're going to have to comply with audits. You're going to have to do all of these other things that you're responsible for as the named insured on a traditional work comp policy.
And if I pay payroll service to, if I use payroll to pay all my crew members, then I don't need a separate workers' comp system because it's going through the payroll company.
Right. As long as you're clear that you're reporting all the people that are getting covered on the payroll, and it's something that when you're working with your payroll company, it becomes very easy to verify. But just making sure that if you report that you have people doing a shoot in Georgia, but then you have some people in South Carolina, you need to report those, because if you don't have coverage for them in South Carolina and you're not running that through the payroll company, then you have a gap in your risk management program.
So we have someone who said in California, labor laws would mean a hair and makeup artist has to go on payroll even if they have an LLC or S corp. Please check with each state's payroll companies. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. That we have the ABC test where they determine whether somebody is considered an employee or not. So I wouldn't necessarily say, yes, that may be the case, but there may be cases where if they pass the ABC test and they can still be a contractor and not an employee. Do you know much about that, Chad?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a little bit outside my scope because you might have some labor elements built into that. But what I would add is California is a very dynamic environment right now. We have AB5, we have the ABC versus the dynamics test. We have a lot of moving parts going on here. And whenever you have so many moving parts, one, it becomes easy to miss something that changes within the system. And two, just to get caught with a liability that you weren't anticipating. So I think whenever you have those scenarios, it's something we can take a deeper dive at. I'm always available to.
I honestly, for myself, it's constantly this question of, do I let this person, how do I manage this person who is traditionally a contractor, and do I try to tell them they need to be an employee, or do I say fine, be a contractor, and how do you kind of handle this stuff? Like, and
even prior to the AB5 and all these other tests that we have, if you look going back even 15, 20 years, one of the common elements that was used as a test is what's the level of direction and control. And in a lot of these instances, there does become a level of direction and control that can further gray the lines on this and make the distinctions tougher. So, unfortunately, it does become, as producers and operators, it becomes a very tough thing to look at.
Right.
I don't think we're going to be able to get to all these questions.
Yeah, I wanted to
because we have other people.
Dan for the moment, and I something we discussed with you, Chad, feels like it can roll over to you, Dan, in the sense that we were talking about if somebody shows up on with a fever on set. I think it'd be great to hear from you what kind of protocol you have, and in your experience, what a set medic would be doing in the likelihood of that, and if if that happens, what happens to the set? Does the production, can it still keep moving on?
Then you're gonna have to unmute Dan.
Okay, sorry about that. That's actually why I was late. I'm on one of our sites where we have about 500 construction workers, and we had this issue pop up at lunch. Beginning a day, if they're coming on set and they have a temperature, they're going, say they come in and they have a 100.0. We put them aside, we give them 15 minutes, let's see if they'll cool down, give them a bottle of water or something to drink. And at the 15-minute mark, if they're still above the target threshold, which at this point is 99.6 degrees, they're sent home. The production can resume because at the beginning of the day, they've not started. No, the cross-contamination risk is not there. It's very low. You have to, for CDC, doesn't consider it a contact with an infected person if the time frame is less than 15 minutes, because the odds of transmission are statistical zero. They're not zero, but they're pretty close.
Yeah, that's
and good. What happened today, which is why I was late to the call, is this individual is being sent home. They were a contractor to the general contractor, so they have their return to work policy. So they're going to see their doctor. just as a precaution due to the pandemic. But until his results come back, he's not on site.
Right.
But what we did immediately is, on our end, is all of our gear was immediately decontaminated using an EPA List N cleaner. If you run on Google EPA List N, it'll bring up all of the cleansers that'll take Corona out, as long as you follow the directions. Sort of as a note, the wet time is pretty significant, so different cleaners have different times. It's not just a spray and wipe down and you're good on some of them.
So when you do that check-in, do you try to say do it outdoors, or does it matter? Can they come indoors to?
Generally, we try to have it away from the set, sort of the parking lot. But the biggest one is, especially when we have areas where environmental factors can be a consideration. It being hotter or much colder, you know, if a cool breeze is coming through, it can alter the scans by upwards of 5 degrees. So somebody who has a fever could show no fever at all. So what we do is we make sure they're in an environment that's controlled, an office or a block off, say a motorhome for a set, and we'll check them.
Oh,
and
yeah,
the one I do,
100 degrees out, you're saying that would affect the temperature, the thermometer.
Most of the thermometers have a automatic calibration and adjustment. With us, our thermometers are turned on and running active 15 minutes before their first scan, which is what the manufacturer has listed in the manual that comes with each one of the ones that we use.
Got it. Yeah, one of my questions was going to be, you know, if you can, you know, take people a little bit through the process, you know, and I'd love to kind of hear from you if you know, I'm assuming obviously you're a medic and you would recommend every set to have somebody, you know, some people kind of, especially with smaller shoots and the budgets aren't huge, you know, that there's some reluctance, of course, but if you can just give us a sense of like what some of the general protocol for you is, and what you think the overall necessity of having a set medic versus having a production assistant or someone else, you know, be doing the same job.
Sort of walk through how I do things, because I've already done 4 productions here in Texas for commercials that we've had. The beginning of the day, the first thing I do is, while I'm waiting for the 15-minute period on the thermometers I keep, is I'm observing the crew. I'm looking for signs and symptoms of, you know, is somebody not feeling well, pale, little telltales to see if, you know, they may say, well, I'm fine, but they don't look it, because there's, understand with the lockdowns and all that, a lot of people are reluctant to say something because money's been tight, no money coming in type thing. This is where the subtlety of having an EMT, paramedic, or a trained healthcare provider really helps to get the subtleties, because at times it's it can be, they could be barely over the threshold, but they're exhibiting small signs and symptoms that a PA might not catch. Just as an example, when I'm screening somebody, I'm looking at them as we're talking, I'm seeing their skin color, you know, is there any signs of maybe other disease processes going on, because of the signs, the general signs and symptoms can be very close related to the flu, the common cold, sinus infections, etc. I ask them basic questions, you know, and say, you had a cough, or if, say, they're a smoker, is your cough changed? Is it drier? You know, has it been productive in the past and now it's dry, etc. Fatigue. I also ask a travel history. Going back a month, I would, in Texas, I would ask, have you been to the Houston area, or have you been to New Orleans recently, or New York, which were the major hotspots were. Some productions we have a sheet we use. Other productions we have a online form that they go in, and it's all HIPAA compliant, and they can answer the questions, and it'll give them either a thumbs up or a green check mark, or it'll give a red check mark, you know, hold up, talk to the medic. Because there's some of the signs and symptoms, there's a split that they could say yes, but it's not a red flag. Actually, let me bring up one of the questions is have or do you have chills? This is also looking for the muscle weakness. That is one of the CDC symptoms, signs and symptoms that was added here about 6 weeks ago at this point. So it would have been mid-April. And this all takes less than 30 seconds per person. And as I'm doing this, you know, I'll take their temperature. The thing I do is I always use the temple, and that I avoid taking a temperature straight on because it makes people feel uncomfortable, because it is like having a weapon pointed at somebody. It can give people that anxiety, and that's not what we're trying to do when we're screening people.
Now, you know, there's lots of talk about how, you know, thermometer is there's probably 30 or is it 40% of the actual COVID cases have a temperature, and then there's also the talk about whether to do an oximeter. Can you kind of just give us your perspective on all that?
The use of a pulsometer, pulse ox or pulse ox, I'll leave it at pulse ox. I can't talk today. That is in people that are already proven positive and are in the hospital. The reason they're looking at the oxygen levels is in more advanced disease process, they're seeing the oxygen saturation percentage drop drastically, but then be talking normally, not complaining of shortness of breath. That's more of a intensive care ICU management tool. On a set or in a studio, it's of limited value, because you can have some your average person's going to be between 96 and 100%. Well, a smoker may be 95, 94, 93, 92 as their normal. So that's why there's some differentiation, and the pulse oximetry really comes with inpatient care under a doctor or in the intensive care unit.
Right. Part of why I'm asking is, you know, people are buying them, and I think I even heard they're using them at some airports. But you're saying that it's generally being used if someone's like clearly sick and they've been deemed that they already have COVID.
Yes.
Got it.
Somebody is asking are you on the set all day? Are you policing to make sure that people have their masks on and social distancing? Is that part of the job?
Yes, we do. The productions I've been on, I've been there to do the normal set medic duties, but as well as COVID screening. And I wouldn't say enforcing social distancing. I use it as a reminder, you know, because I understand a lot of departments are used to working together before all of this happened. And it's just a general reminder. I'll come up with keeping distance, you know, hey, can we get some space? Or, you know, one of the producers on one of the sets, because we were covering nearly 15 acres, we had hand signals where she had to remind a couple of the grips at the time for a little bit of distance.
And do they go over with you their production guidelines beforehand, and then do you review them with the production to see that they're doing things correctly?
A lot of the productions we're working with are using our guidelines. On nationalsetmedics.com, on the front page, we have the latest version. That's, I think, 2.5 or 2.6 is the latest version. And those are sent to the production ahead of time when they book one of our myself or one of our medics. And as part of the safety meeting, I explain, you know, this is what I'm here for. Here are the rules, you know, 6 feet apart, make sure you're wearing your face covering or mask. And generally, I'm monitoring like I would normally for safety issues, so somebody doesn't trip over a cord or a light stand, as well as make sure keeping distances, things are keeping clean and we're not cross-contaminating gear.
And are you bringing any of the PPE?
A lot of the productions are providing them. Let's see. Zarnowski, they were was the last commercial I was on. They were providing surgical masks for everybody on the crew. They had somebody who was cleaning the rails and frequently touched surfaces. And then each group within the production, camera, hair and makeup, they were all separated from each other. And we understand at certain points they have to come, people have to get together to work on something, but as soon as they were done, they separated back out.
And can you give a rough idea of costs for a set medic?
Set medic it's dependent on the level of care. The basic level is $50 an hour. In the San Francisco area, it's a 6-hour minimum. We're across the country. We've got 6,300 medics across the country that we do, and it's generally $50 an hour with the 6-hour minimum.
And you were talking about, someone was asking, do you need to be on set all day? And I know we were talking about you having need sometimes to check temperature different times. And
yes. For the production, I show up at the beginning of the day, typically within 15 to 30 minutes of general crew call, or I show up. Different clients have us come in at different times. Most of them, I'm coming in at the exact same time as crew call. So before I get there, I'm already getting thermometers adjusted. So as soon as I arrive, I can start going through the whole crew as they're unpacking the trucks or the vehicles. And then, yes, we do check temperatures 3 times a day. We check it beginning of day, coming back from lunch, and then when wrap is called. And this is because people who are sick with COVID and starting to show symptoms can show it in a very, very short period of time, sometimes under 2 to 4 hours.
So as you've heard, or actually you weren't on the call when I mentioned it, but the state of Washington in their guidelines mentioned having a COVID compliance officer. These new guidelines, this white paper that just came out yesterday also talked about having the same thing. Can you give us a sense for, can a set medic be that COVID compliance officer? And is there any kind of thing you've heard from nationally, statewide about what kind of training this kind of compliance officer would have?
It's typically been combined with the set medic. It's just a little of an extension. Every one of the medics that we have that's actively working sites now, either in the construction industry or for set, they're doing both, and they're trained. We go, they meet with me personally on our group. I'll talk with them, ask them what have they dealt with. A lot of our EMTs and paramedics are dealing with this because they work 911. They've gotten training from their education people, as well as their safety teams. And then it's the public health department also comes in as well to help them out. I think there was a question that popped up about the city of San Francisco. Is a set medic required? That I'm not sure. I would have to delve into the regulations of the city. I'm not sure.
I mean, from what Susanna said, as so far as of now, doesn't sound like it, right?
That's not part of our current guidelines, but I mean, again, I think once the governor releases his guidelines, it's going to formulate more guidelines for us. But we do have a symptom checklist that everybody has to have their cast and crew fill out, and that's something that is on our guidelines on our website. And it's basically a symptom checklist, and it asks a number of questions. And if you do have a temperature, or you do have any of the symptoms that are listed there, you don't go to set that day. You can't work. So, but I really like, Dan, when you were talking about this online form, and hopefully I could get a link to that so I can see how we could create something like that. But right now we're not requiring a set medic.
Yeah. we have a test engine that's up on the website right now on nationalsetmedics.com.
Okay.
It's HIPAA compliant. It's on our secured server. There's only 2 people who have access to that data. That's myself and Dan Schlund, who is the owner of National Set Medics. And then in the event if something were to happen, we can pull the records from that production for public health use as well as the employer.
I can post it in our chat right now. Is it the version 2? Is that the latest? Or
the guidelines, if you take the guidelines link off the webpage, that's the most up-to-date version.
Okay, I'm gonna just post it in the chat now, and we'll also put it in our email following later. Okay, get there. Good. There we go. Anyone else have any other questions for Dan? You know, again, around makeup artists, what are you seeing, and what are your recommendations for in terms of taking off masks and leaving them on, and
general recommendation would be, once the mask is on, are you talking about the talent or the artist themselves, the makeup artist?
I guess both.
Okay. The makeup artist, I would say it needs to stay on, because that, if they're using a cloth face covering,
and we're hearing they're also putting a shield.
Yes. The last 3 commercials I worked, the makeup artist, it was the same makeup artist across the last 3. They used the first one, they used a disposable face shield, and I gave them a link to a reusable one that would survive the cleaning process. And they ordered that. It looks like a welding helmet, but it's much more comfortable. And the disposable ones are now back in stock. I actually saw them on Amazon on the unrestricted section last night. But generally on the talent, they're going to have to, the talent's going to have to take their mask off to have their makeup done. And then unfortunately put the mask back on until time, and then just a quick touch up, unless the makeup is minimal and they're going straight to set as soon as they're done.
Right. Yeah, so those kind of recommendations and how those relate to what the cities and states are going to say, I think that's where maybe some communication needs to happen, and some figuring out. Susanna, I know you're working with everyone at the city level to, like, these kinds of questions that need to be addressed for any guidelines. Is there anything you would want to say to people about whether they make recommendations, or how to help you make the best guidelines that you can make?
Well, I'm happy for anyone to email me suggestions or questions. My email is susanna.robbins@sfgov.org. But what I think is, in addition to sending the white pages to our city attorney, I will also be sending probably a copy of the AICP guidelines, just because they're broken out a lot more, which are actually very similar, just so you know, to Georgia guidelines, and also to Clearwater, Florida. They all have everyone pretty much has the same kind of guidelines. But yeah, I'm happy for questions as well as suggestions. And then now that I know about this national setmedics.com email address, I think I'll look, or no, I'm sorry, web address, I will look on that also, so I can, again, be giving them more information. And I really wish we had, you know, simpler answers, and I could say, hey, we can do this today. But I just have to stress again, this is uncharted water, and nobody wants to go back to work too quickly where things are not safe for everybody. So we're working our best to make it so that people can work, but we also just want to make sure that everyone's really safe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to move over to talking with Sean and Paul. It's great to hear. We have a case study, as everyone's been calling them, where you both were involved in a recent photo production, stills and motion shoot. Looking forward to hearing some of what the details of that were. If you want to kind of just kind of fill us in with a little summary to start off, and go from
You
there.
both need to unmute.
Cool. So, so the job was first originally awarded, I believe, in early part of March. So it was pre-COVID, and then it got basically postponed. And then, you know, the client basically had a product that they wanted to launch, and, you know, without pictures of the product, you can't, or video, you can't launch, you can't sell a product. So it had kind of come down to that particular scenario. And we worked out of state in Moab, Utah. And the interesting comparison about the job pre and post is the increase in cost for me was about 25% in relationship to a regular shoot. And that was due to, you know, requiring PPE, requiring masks, gloves, sanitizer, hand washing stations, portable restrooms. And then also, you know, on Paul's end, the use of a medic for temperature checks every 24 hours, wellness checks, the sanitation company, and I'll let Paul get into all this stuff as soon as I go over the summary. Sanitation for dry spray disinfectants and UV kind of sanitation with vehicles and people's equipment. And then in terms of that, then there was also the hiring process. You know, originally a few people that were on the job that I had estimated declined because they thought it was too soon. You know, they were all notified kind of as we were bidding the job that because of, you know, the circumstances, we would be taking certain safety precautions because of COVID-19 in terms of social distancing, using masks. Everybody had to wear gloves. You know, if you at any point took off your, you know, touch your mouth or your face or, you know, any of that type of scenario, you'd have to, you know, re-sanitize your hands and put on sterile gloves again. And then also we would take breaks throughout the day. And understanding that it was a sensitive situation, you know, part of the increase in cost was extending it from a 2-day shoot to a 3-day shoot. And that was just so we could fit all of these safety precautions within the day. And the last thing we wanted to do was rush to a point where we wouldn't be able to ensure everyone's safety, because that at this point with the job was everybody's number one concern, was that the only way we're going to go through with this is if we could do it safely and protect everybody. And require, you know, with all these rules and regulations that we're requiring everyone to follow, that kind of ensured, or it didn't ensure, but it was the best we could do in terms of protecting everyone's safety from the virus and everyone else. So if we all followed these rules, though they may feel uncomfortable at times because it's a new scenario, it was kind of something that we were all agreed we were doing to protect one another as well as ourselves throughout the process. Now, Paul, I'm going to have you talk to this in terms of the, you know, once the job was awarded, we were kind of, you know, what you went through in terms of permitting and locations and gathering, you know, like hotels and all that equipment. So go ahead.
Sure. And just to expand a little bit on one of the things that Sean touched on, when the job awarded, And leading up to the award, actually, while we were bidding the job, we were thinking about, you know, there aren't really concrete guidelines at that time regarding what we were supposed to do, other than keep 6 feet apart and provide PPE. And we decided we would try to take it really to a different level. And I immediately started researching germ mitigation companies. Because we were shooting in Moab, I was looking in Salt Lake. And I found a company whose day job it is to disinfect hospital rooms and hospital equipment. And they were licensed, bonded, and certified in the use of all the chemicals that they would be using. I had a long series of conversations with the owner of this company, who used a variety of methods for disinfecting, from a dry mist fog that was actually made up of, I think, hydrogen peroxide, to surface disinfectants and UV light. And I decided to hire him, which was not inexpensive. And then I immediately put him on the phone with all the departments who had sensitive electronic equipment. The camera department, including the rental house where we got the camera gear, our Russian arm camera car. Those were the primary departments that he'd be interacting with. And I let them work out their disinfecting protocols. So in addition to his disinfecting, he also prepped disinfecting kits and gave them to each department. And those were comprised of spray disinfectant and wipes and rags. So we had a constant disinfecting of every surface and every working environment for the entire 3 days of our shoot, plus the day before, the prep day when everybody arrived on location. And it's something that made the crew very comfortable. It's something that I firmly believe is not the domain of a production assistant or an untrained professional. And I also believe that we're going to see somebody like this on virtually every, at least on the live action side, we're going to see a person like this on every shoot going forward. In terms of permitting, to your question, Sean, we had previously scouted this, this area back in late February when it was going to shoot in early March before the lockdown. And we were lucky enough to find a primary location that was all on private property, which meant we really didn't have to deal with the BLM or Park Service or any of those authorities. So we had already scouted, the director and I had already gone to location, done a very exhaustively comprehensive recce of where we wanted to shoot. So when this job came back around several weeks ago with a very short prep time, we were already prepared with our location. However, the director now, and back in the early March, the shoot was supposed to be a night shoot. So now that it was a day shoot, the director wanted to add a location he had previously shot at, which was on BLM land. Plus, we had to permit a highway for some car-to-car footage. Luckily for us, our location manager in Moab is very tied into the BLM, very tied into all the permitting authorities, and they were able to turn around our permits in days rather than the weeks that the BLM usually requires. But what we found out was that, and Susanna, maybe Susanna has now left, but
yeah, I have to sign off, unfortunately.
All right, but what we found out was the state has one set of health guidelines, the city has their own set of health guidelines, And the BLM has their own set of health guidelines. So just because you have the health guidelines set up by the state, that doesn't mean you're necessarily in compliance with the city and whatever permitting authority you're now having to deal with. And that's something that we all have to be really cognizant of. For instance, the day before, or several days before we shot, Utah issued a new set of guidelines. It was broken into guidelines for business and guidelines for not business. And in the not business side, they said no social gatherings of more than 10 people, which is, you know, a guideline we've now all heard a lot over the past several months. So the BLM kind of latched on to that and said, okay, well, you know, you can't have a crew of more than 10 people. Well, we had close to 28 people, which is a much larger footprint than I wanted to have, but that's what we ended up with. And that's not necessarily including Sean and his 7 crew members. But if you keep reading on those guidelines in business, you know, they don't address, unfortunately, the film business or the print photography business. But in conversations with the Utah Film Commissioner, we decided that we were really a construction business. There was nothing closer to us than a construction business, which did not limit the number of people that could be on a set. The BLM didn't really like that interpretation. But when they visited the set, well, they issued us our permit, and when they visited our set to see if we were in compliance, the way we had physically arranged base camp and the methods that we took to institute our own protocol were satisfactory for them, and they didn't raise an issue about it. But just, so my advice is just be sure that you know what the guidelines are for wherever you're shooting, and there very likely could be more than one set. The other thing that we did in terms of protocol was we knew that we needed hand washing stations, and we weren't able to procure any in Utah. Our rental house could get one. And for 30 people, we felt that that wasn't enough. And a friend of mine had mentioned a shoot that they had at some point where they found a trailer that had a bunch of sinks in it. And I found that trailer, and it's a 16-foot trailer with doors that open up, the canopy up to reveal 6 sinks on either side. And it comes with 300 gallons of water. And the guy lives in Seattle. I've since found more of those, but this is the first one I found. We booked him. He hauled butt out to Utah, and we set up. So now we had a big place where people could wash their hands and not be close to one another. But because there were 6 sinks on either side and they were right next to each other, we actually decommissioned every other sink so people wouldn't be butting up against each other. You know, that's another thing that we did that was kind of beyond what anybody had suggested at the time that we should be doing to protect the crew. Sean, do you want me to go through some of the other things that we did?
Yeah, so it was the sanitation and the medic, like the process with that each day.
Right. So we had a medic who took everybody's temperature and logged everybody's temperature every morning. The medics sent out a questionnaire before the shoot to the entire crew. The production company also sent out a notice of COVID guidelines that all the crew members had to return and sign before the shoot. So Dan, to your earlier point, you know, that was to bring everybody's awareness level up. So everybody knew what we were doing and everybody knew what was expected of them. And in our safety meeting, one of the things that we stressed was, you know, we can provide all these measures, but the crew has to play their own part in being proactive in their own health. You know, so there were constant reminders of, you know, to make everybody remain at a far enough social distance that everybody felt comfortable. But again, to your point, Dan, there are times when people had to not social distance. So we did that. We also made a point of not ordering lunch tables as part of our production supplies, because we didn't want to tempt people to congregate while they were eating, or while they had a moment to hang between setups. You know, we did order a bunch of folding chairs that were sanitized by our germ guy. And then those chairs were very purposely set up through base camp at probably 3 times the social distance, the recommended social distance. So people would have a place to eat, to sit and eat, other than inside their cars, because everybody self-drove to location. And that was important to us as well. And to me, the big thing was the crew took it in stride. The crew was happy that we were thinking about their health and safety and welfare. And nobody really raised a complaint, although we really solicited input from everybody as to, you know, what we could do better, what they felt uncomfortable about. And the suggestions were really kind of few and far between. And I feel that we, as Sean said, we did the best we could to keep everybody safe.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in a way, just hearing you say all of this, it's like being a producer. You know, it's like all the other work you've done in the past, where you're problem solving. You know, you have lots of challenges, and it takes a lot of investigating, making phone calls, kind of just talking through a lot of things like any other issue. And yeah, it sounds like you had quite a lot of, especially with the different guidelines that you had to work through.
Right. And, you know, and we had a cast. We had a cast of a mom and a son. Mm-hmm. We cast locally because we didn't want to travel people in. We cast for an actual mom and son, which we found. We had her do her own makeup, and we did makeup tests beforehand to get the client to sign off. So we did not have hair and makeup and wardrobe with us. For us, that worked out, you know, and what we did is not a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, every shoot is going to be different. But saying that, I also want to point out that the creative concept that we were handed by our client was doable within the constraints that we were given. And, you know, Nader, to your comment a second ago, you know, we problem solved it. Well, you know, that's what production has always been able to do. You know, we're handed a concept by a client or an ad agency, and we basically problem solve their way out of it, right? Today, I think and it pains me to say this, we can't be handed just any concept and expect that we can do the same thing. Concepts have to fit now within the constraints with which we find ourselves in. And to try to work outside of those, meaning you know, a huge cast and background people and multiple, you know, locations, you know, it's going to be problematic.
Were there certain shots that you wanted to get that, or that the client wanted to get, that you actually ended up not being able to get? Or
no, not for us, because we were able to produce the concept within what we could or could not do. Mm-hmm. So it was not a complex concept. You know, it involved a mom and a son in a car, on road and off road, and then a reuniting with a lost dog. So we were able to work within those creative guidelines and still keep everybody safe at the same time. Had it been a much larger cast, and had there been many other vehicles involved, or had we had to have a larger crew footprint than we did, then, you know, well, I'll tell you, the client, when this job came back, they wanted us to go with the original night concept, which would have been a helicopter and a crew of 60 plus people. And we said no. We said it cannot be done and keep everybody safe at the same time. So it turned into a day concept, which, I don't know, arguably is a better concept, because now you see the landscape you're in rather than just hints of it at night.
Yeah.
Can Sean, can you speak to the dealing with the PPE as a photographer and the gloves and your decisions about like trying to work with those constraints?
So can I give you like so basically the client wasn't there, first of all. And that was kind of the agreement. It was kind of like, we're going to do whatever we can pre-production wise to get you guys exactly what we're going to do before we actually do it, in terms of, you know, the tech scout images and where the vehicle is going to be. And then, you know, the idea was then to get them to sign off on that before any of the photos had actually taken place. So in regards to the PPE, we had step-by-step guidelines as to how the day was going to go. I had the food pre-ordered by the crew from the catering company. The catering company, by the way, was a husband and wife team that had a motorhome. It was totally open with a bathroom trailer. And then they also handled the food. And because some restaurants were open and some restaurants were closed, I didn't want to do a 15-hour day, which I budgeted for, because it took half an hour to get to the location and then another half an hour to get to the shoot spot before, you know, to be right at sunrise. And then actually have to go find food after the day. So I had them pre-plan all 3 meals for each day, which saved us a bunch of time and a lot of stress. And the way meals were done was that basically each person's food came in an enclosed container with their name on it, and we all took turns taking it. Because we were all required to drive in our own vehicles, we then had the option of sitting in our own chair or sitting in our own vehicle to eat our own food. So we're always socially distant. Now, beforehand, I'd actually reached out to Robert Bacall, you know, and was talking about the scenario, and he had a PPE contact, and we had pre-ordered the 100, and I think it was 1,000 masks beforehand from a supplier on the East Coast. And then in terms of sanitizer and gloves, I had procured all my stuff basically every single morning, you know, waiting in line at Target and Smart & Final in order to get the gear that I needed to be able to supply and, you know, provide a safe environment for everybody once they got on set. And then, you know, on the day of shooting, you went down to the lobby, you got your temperature checked, signed off by the medic, then you left the location. And then basically once arriving there, you had your mask, you handed your cell phone over to luckily our motorhome person was in charge of desanitizing everybody's cell phone. You washed your hands, you put sterile gloves on, you got your cell phone back, and then you proceeded back onto the location. Again, like Paul was saying, when everybody arrived to the location the day before, everybody got the dry spray and the UV scans of their, inside their vehicles, aside from camera gear, with equipment open. And then once on location, it was just a matter of, the Digitech was in his area away from me. I had a separate monitor to look at that he was broadcasting to. The assistants were kind of trying to touch only the gear that they were touching. They were kind of using the foam core as a way to stay socially distant, with 6 to 8 feet. And then it was just a matter of always constantly having gloves and masks on at all times. And I think that's kind of what it was. It was uncomfortable at first, but I think once you kind of got into the rhythm and figured out what worked best for you, it was a matter of, kind of putting that aside and focusing on creating content, and generating.
I think you had mentioned when we talked the other day about the powder from the gloves that there's.
Right. Yeah. So some of the gloves I'd gotten, come with powder, so that way when you're sweating inside, the gloves don't stick to your hands, and that actually I have sensitive skin, became an irritant, for me, and that in combination with the alcohol disinfectant, rubbing my hands constantly and putting the gloves on, it became a bit raw over time. But
was there a heat problem? Was it hot when you were shooting there? Or?
No, it was pretty, 80 degrees maybe. Nothing super hot.
I will say, wearing a mask for 12 hours is very uncomfortable. And it's important that everybody have some time away from the mask. And, Sean increased, his shoot from 2 to 3 days. We did the same thing, knowing that things would just work more slowly and that we just needed to give people breaks, which we built into our shooting schedule. Yeah, that can't be really understated. That it takes a while to get used to it. And then, Sean mentioned not wanting to shoot 15-hour days. We did the same thing. We budgeted for 12-hour days, which would include our travel to and from the hotel, knowing that we'd be leaving a sunrise or a sunset on the floor each day, and we'd have to pick one or the other. But we just couldn't fathom working the crew longer than those hours in these circumstances.
I think we want to start wrapping up here, but Sean, a couple things I wanted to ask you. One, how you managed people going in and out of the motorhome, and then also just give us a little sense of, a lot of this stuff is like technical and the details of it all, but like, how was it for you kind of emotionally? And I guess you, Paul, as well, just, it all sounds simple to put all this stuff in place, but like, what was going on inside for you? Like it's for this to be I guess it was your first shoot back, right?
Yeah. So it was interesting because, the reality, it became real when I reached out to one person on the crew when we were doing the estimates, and they said, no, I can't do it. It's too soon. I'm not comfortable. And that's, when it made me realize, like, wow, I guess, we really have to kind of communicate how sensitive everybody will be about, what's going on. If anybody, if at any point anyone feels overwhelmed, to just, say something, and, we'll all just take a break. And that was kind of the agreement, with the client, was that, the expectations are in place for what you want us to deliver. But at the end of the day, safety's first. And if we can't provide that safety for any reason, we'll have to walk away, and that's the way it'll be. And I think that's, with all the safety measures and everything, it's a lot to do for one person, in terms of just generating content, producing the shoot. There's things I definitely would have done differently, but, I know, in relationship to all the jobs I've done in the past, most of the time, people are always looking to cut back on costs. And I know, with the budgets and the way the economy is, and people are going to be expecting people to work for less. And I think that at the same time, if that is the case, it needs to be the expectations need to be a lot less as well. And they need to be parallel to what the ask is, in both respects, because ultimately at the end of the day, when doing these jobs, you need to ensure everyone's safety. That's what made it so comfortable to do, is if you couldn't provide the safety for everybody that was working on this job, there was literally no point in doing it. I mean, you know, and we took it so seriously that even when I came home, I had my wife and daughter quarantined with my in-laws till I got my COVID test back that I, you know, took the second I had gotten back to Los Angeles, you know, and didn't see them until it was negative. Because the last, you know, my biggest concern was going to a place that I hadn't quarantined, you know, and been exposed to different people and different things, and then, you know, brought something back, you know, and at the end of the day, you know, if you're taking these risks and you're not being safe, you not only put yourself and your career at risk, you also jeopardize the client and their reputation. Because if somebody gets sick or someone dies, it's not just on you, it's on everyone involved. You know, and the blowback from something happening is so much greater than the few $100 or $1,000 you might save by cutting out safety gear. It just, the thing I can't iterate it enough or stress enough is that people need to take this seriously. These safety precautions are mandatory. They're not a suggestion. You know, if you do these shoots and you take, I mean, the fact we're doing shoots is a risk in itself, but to do this stuff and put even more risk on the table, you know, you jeopardize even more. And then you have to think of the repercussions of that. What if something like that does happen? Well, then all of a sudden a client may be left to be put in a position to figure out another way to generate content. And then that, and in the end, could screw everybody in terms of, you know, what they do for work, or, you know, so not only you're protecting yourself, you're protecting everybody else in the industry, which I think is basically the whole point of, you know, wearing a mask and protecting yourself. You're protecting everyone else. And that should be, you know,
what would you say to photographers who, you know, wouldn't have as much of a budget as you were able to have, and whose clients may not be as educated about, you know, about all the safety precautions that, you know, we're all spending so much time on this, but the reality is there's so many businesses out there, and they're marketing and like producers that may not be spending this much time getting to, you know, educate themselves. How would you, like, what advice do you give about negotiating with clients, and how much to allow them to get to say, you know, we're not going to have this a level of, you know, safety on set?
So I would say, I mean, first, you know, it's understanding the rules and regulations, finding out what is required by law. So that way everybody, you know, because then at that point you have to think about insurance and like workers' comp, like, will that stuff cover things if you aren't doing things illegally, you know, so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, you know, I'd say half, if not more than half of the jobs I do are, you know, at a point where, you know, the budgets are small and they don't have enough to do, they only have so much to do certain things. And I would say that, you know, since we're all coming out of this gate together, that now's the time to put your foot down and say what you won't do. Because if you feel uncomfortable doing something, the uncomfort you're going to feel when somebody gets sick and they're pointing the finger at you is going to be so much greater than if you just take the time to say no. Like my rule is they respect you just as much for what you won't do as for what you're protecting them from happening.
Well said, well said.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much. You know, I know we can continue this conversation. There's definitely a lot more to talk about. I think that let's leave it at this for now. Juliet, is there anything you wanted to add? Thank you so much, Sean and Paul, for giving us a look inside your production. Yes, it was not easy, but thank you for being the quote unquote guinea pigs. We really appreciate, you know, all the advice and, you know, putting yourselves out there in front of an audience to talk about this stuff. It's not easy. So.
And Andrea Stern has asked Sean Rice some questions that are going to be on Ask Andrea Stern on her her feed later in the week or next week. So look for that. We'll put a link up on our site. If I don't have it in time for tomorrow's email, that'll go out to everybody. We'll be posting it on our site, that a link to more question and answers from Sean and Paul. And then if there's other questions that come up, we'll provide everybody's information on our link, but also send us the questions and we'll see if we can get them answered for you. But thank you to everybody who's participated.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Jan, thanks Sean, thanks Susanna and Chad. Paul, thank you again, and stay safe. And as I always say, community is gonna help us get through this, and let's keep supporting each other. All right, well, have a good week, and see you next Tuesday. Okay, take care.
Thanks.
Bye.